Welcome, Marianne, to the Humanities team in this forum to discuss the U.S. presidential election and your candidacy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate it, and we have got a lot of great discussion. So let's jump right in. You've shared that you're bringing an important voice, a conscious voice, to the U.S. presidential election. So maybe we can start here.
You and I, and most of your viewers and listeners, already have a foundation of a more integrative, holistic approach to life. We know that what happens on the outside is a symptom that has a cause, is an effect that has a cause, is only part of what's happening because we are multidimensional beings. And that more integrative perspective on life has influenced everything. It has influenced the way we see medicine. It has influenced the way we see relationships. It has influenced so much about just the human experience in our modern society. But that perspective doesn't seem to have gotten to politics yet. And so politics still gets played in a very mechanistic way, that we're only looking at what happens on the outside. We're only looking at the symptoms. We're looking at the world in a very mechanistic way, an old Newtonian model, like everything's a machine. And then if it needs to be fixed, you just tweak it a little bit here and you tweak it a little bit there. But you can't transform anything that way. You can fix temporarily, but you can't transform things. Because all a nation is a group of people. So the same psychological and emotional and spiritual principles that prevail within the journey of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. I'm looking at America holistically. I'm looking at America in terms of everything on the outside being an expression of who we are on the inside. And I'm looking at America in the sense that we will not transform as a country until we apply those deeper principles, those deeper moral and emotional and psychological principles. So I think that the perspective out of which my campaign emerges has it's a deeper dive into a deeper conversation about where we've come from as a nation, where we are as a nation, and where we need to be going.
Yes, so when you share that the politics today has, you call it two broken arms and two broken legs, is this what you're getting at, that it's up at a superficial level, we're not getting down into the deeper issues that we need to be exploring?
Well, the reason we're not getting into the deeper issues that we need to be exploring is because when you do, there's some pretty horrifying stuff. You know, in my career, 35 years, I always say that time somebody comes to someone like myself for deep transformational work, it's understood that you're going to have to get real, and you're going to have to get honest, and you're going to have to take a brutally honest look at yourself. You're going to have to take what they call in AA, that fearless moral inventory. And that is your only possibility, although it is a sure guarantee for transformation. Our political system doesn't get deeply real, because if our political system got deeply real, it would see that it itself is the problem. So we don't just have a swamp. We have an ocean of corruption. Our government no longer functions as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And you know, this is an example. We need to take in these facts at a very deep psychological and emotional level. If you just say, our first principles are that all men are created equal. Our first principles are that God gave all men unalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. That governments are instituted among men to secure those rights, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Those, the first three from the Declaration of Independence, the fourth from the Gettysburg Address. If those principles are just put on marble walls somewhere, or inscribed in parchment under glass somewhere, but not inscribed in our hearts, they lose their moral force. And those principles inscribed on our hearts, generation after generation, that is the only safe repository for our freedom. Because those principles, when you really take them in psychologically, you really take them in emotionally, and then you look at the way America functions today, you would go, wow, whoa, whoa. Because we're not a government functioning of the people, by the people, for the people. We are a government that functions of a few of the people and by a few of the people and for a few of the people, of huge multinational corporate interests, by huge multinational corporate interests, and for huge multinational corporate interests. Now, most, not all, but most politicians are so tied in one way or the other with those huge multinational corporate interests that even when they suggest a solution to the problem that is caused by this injustice, they're talking about the symptom, but they're not naming the cause. They're watering the leaves, but they're not watering the roots. So they represent incremental change at best. They are forces that seek to ameliorate all the pain that is produced by all this, but they don't challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. Now, for many traditional politicians, the risk lies in getting honest about all this, because I don't think I've said anything that every Democratic candidate, let's say, doesn't know. They know this is true. The issue is being willing to name it. So the issue is some would try to make the symptoms better, but as we know, with a holistic integrative healing, all you do is treat the symptom, it'll reiterate. Now, many traditional politicians, for them, the risk lies in getting down and telling the truth on the level we're talking about. For me, the professional risk lies in not telling the truth, because I emerge from a field where that is the skill set. You know, the last thing I need is for a bunch of my colleagues in my community to say, oh, it's too bad about Marianne, she used to be a radical truth teller. So I believe that a level of truth-telling, profound truth-telling, and profound willingness on the part of this country to look at ourselves and to face the gap between how we're functioning and what it would mean to truly function as a democracy, the way our founders and our great Americans before us have sought to have this country function. It's a much deeper conversation than is being had by most political candidates. And that's why I feel that my campaign offers another way.
So I think when you were talking here about the small percent, the 1% or so the government represents, this money in politics is a big part of this problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Money, the undue influence of money on our politics is the cancer that underlies all these other cancers. We don't have universal health care because it would cut into short-term profits of health insurance companies and big pharma. We don't have common sense gun safety laws because it would cut into the short-term profits of gun manufacturers. We do not deal yet adequately with the climate crisis because it would cut into short-term profits for the fossil fuel industry. We don't have an agenda for peace so much as an agenda for endless preparation for war, because to do otherwise would cut into the short-term profits of defense contractors. It is that corrupt. So when I'm president, my companions tell me that I should say when I'm president, however that works, whatever the American people choose, one of the first things I would do is submit to Congress legislation to establish public funding for federal campaigns. Because this started back in the 90s. What happened was in the 80s, in 1980 and throughout the 80s, was when there was promulgated this entire economic perspective, trickled down economics, which said that if the corporation exercises only fiduciary financial responsibility to the stockholders, without being stymied anymore by any legal, moral, or ethical responsibility to any other stakeholders, the workers, the environment, the community, et cetera, that would somehow be better for America. Because it said that, yes, a small group of people would have a lot of money, but they're the job creators, and all that money would trickle down to everyone else and lift all boats. After 40 years, I think we can say the jury's in. That theory has not only not lifted all boats, it has left millions of people without even a life vest. It has created the greatest wealth income inequality in almost 100 years. It has decimated America's middle class. And it has created a society where 40% of all Americans are struggling on a daily basis to make basic costs of food and rent and transportation and healthcare. Now, that was in the 80s when that started. In the 90s, this huge flood of money started pouring into the system. So what happened, and then by the time Citizens United Supreme Court came around, you have a government that is now little more than a legalized system of bribery, where our government officials too often are doing more to advocate for that short-term profit than for you and me, because they're returning on their investment. So these huge corporate forces and very, very wealthiest individuals, such as the Koch brothers, et cetera, make sure that they have elected the people that they really want through their donation to their campaigns, through their influencing, through super PACs, et cetera, and the money to defeat other candidates. And then those candidates come in and they do exactly what they were, what they were put there for, such as the passage of the 2017 tax cut, which was $2 trillion. And 83 cents of every dollar goes to the very richest Americans and the very richest corporations. Things like last year alone, $26 billion in corporate subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. Meanwhile, this morning, I met a young woman. She heads a foundation in Detroit for children of incarcerated people. Because right now, with over 2 million people incarcerated, you've got millions of these children, right? And there are no mental health services or anything. So you have a 7-year-old and somebody comes in the middle of the night and takes mommy away, takes daddy away. They're going to be in prison for 2 or 3 years. What happens to these children? So whether it has to do with education, whether it has to do with food, 41 million hungry people in America. This is the richest country in the world. But we have millions of chronically traumatized children. We have millions of American children who go to schools, number one, that don't even have libraries, and that have classrooms without the adequate school supplies to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished. The chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of these children, but the system doesn't address them. The political system just normalizes their despair because they're not old enough to work. So they're not there's no financial leverage. So I'm sorry, I can't still remember, Steve, your original question, but.
Yeah, no, you're coming right in. I was talking about just the influence of money on politics and government.
Yes, so the thing is, because of the current makeup of the Supreme Court, we're not going to be able to overturn Citizens United anytime soon. If the last presidential election had been different, we might have had a chance. So you've really got either a constitutional amendment or legislation that would establish it. The legislation that I speak of public funding of federal campaigns, we wouldn't be able to get if the Senate remains in the hands of the Republicans, but everybody just needs to be very motivated in this next presidential election, and not only for the presidency either.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that because, of course, should you become president, there's a lot we can do, but you still need an electorate. You need a country that gets behind you.
Well, if this country, if the opening occurs and this country elects me, then by definition, this country that's your mandate. The election is your mandate. The issue, though, as you say, has to do with the makeup of the Congress. So, for instance, the president could submit legislation for public funding of federal campaigns, but if you don't have a Senate that would go along, then, it's like it is now. You've got the Democrats in control of the House, but you still got the Republicans in charge of the Senate. Right,
yes. So I'll come back to the electorate and what we can do, but you were actually covering a lot of important ground here. So, and you were driving at just the need for systemic change. So I talked about money and politics, but you were addressing there are many other things here that are there is a swamp actually today in Washington, and you were talking about all of its features. So In your presidency, Marianne, do you believe that you could really create true systemic change going beyond the incremental change that kind of tunes things up?
Well, I'm one of the candidates. I'm not the only one, but I'm one of about 3 or 4 who are suggesting serious pattern interruption, a genuine disruption of the current political and economic status quo. If one of us gets elected, by definition, that is the American people saying, that's what we want. For instance, repeal that 2017 tax cut. Repeal that 2017 tax cut, although I would wish to see the middle class tax cut part of it put back. Close those corporate loopholes. And the president appoints all of the people who are the head of the various departments. For instance, if I'm president, I will appoint a world-class environmentalist to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Right now, our Environmental Protection Agency is headed by an ex-chemical company executive, and before that, it was headed by a oil company executive in this administration. The first thing they did was to gut the Clean Water Act, gut the Clean Air Act, overturn the ban on pesticides that we absolutely know harm a developing child's brain. When I'm president, there will be a world-class environmental scientist, world-class climate scientist who is head of the EPA. The EPA will then become a magnet for world-class climate scientists, environmental scientists, sustainability experts, etc. I understand that saving our environment, we have 12 years to go before there's irreparable harm, and the full force of the executive branch of the government. And yes, the president has a lot of power with which I would not be timid, would be placed at the service of the EPA to do the job. Another example is our State Department. Our State Department is where the programs of the State Department are those which wage peace. Now, in this administration, for instance, the first Secretary of State was the ex-CEO of Exxon. So what does that tell you? That means we've moved from the values question and the peace building and the mediation and the development to the main issue of our foreign policy being how to increase sales and commerce. So when I'm president, you have a world-class humanitarian and diplomat. You know, even Donald Rumsfeld said, who was Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said we must wage peace. And General Mattis, before he left the Defense Department, said that if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. Now, this again is where the transformational our community comes in. The way to wage peace is to expand economic opportunities for women, to expand educational opportunities for children, to reduce violence against women, and to ameliorate unnecessary human suffering wherever it happens. Because desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. But what we're doing, because our agendas on all these areas are driven more by corporate profits, let's look at what's happening here. They are actually cutting the money that is being spent on issues that actually develop peace and build peace. And they are spending more money. We now have the man who was just nominated to be head of the Defense Department was a 30-year veteran of Boeing aircraft. He's a Boeing executive. Right now, hello, Americans, wake up. This administration is saber-rattling against Iran, saber-rattling against Venezuela. They did it in Vietnam. So many of us in the run-up to the to the Iraq War, said this is Vietnam all over again. And they said, oh, don't be silly, this is different. It was not different. And what's happening right now is not different either. This all has to do with profits for what General Eisenhower and President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. So can the president make a difference? You better believe the president makes a difference. President appoints who would be the head of the Defense Department, and the president is the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, so you've really gone into a lot of really important things. I want to just go down into some of them. One of them, the rising carbon emissions, and Bill McKibben, who runs 350.org, said we passed the point where we can do a safe, hard landing. That
yes, he has.
We're now in a very, very challenging spot. So In your administration, Marianne, do you feel that we can get this come back under control and reach back out to the Paris Climate Change Accord and partners to do this?
Of course, I would put us back into the Paris Climate Accords, but we need to go further than that. I mean, we're at this point, it's so dire, it's even worse than that. So I do believe, and I've read enough from those like Bill McKibben that we might not even be able to get a hard landing, but what we could get is an EPA which has everything it possibly would need to bring in the best people, the resources that are necessary, a president who has your back, a president who has made very clear to the American people that the debate is over, that the forces, fossil fuel, chemical, et cetera, who have sought to obstruct an adequate response to climate change in the past, they were wrong then, they're wrong now, and there's no moral equivocation on my part. See, that's what the corporatist candidates say. Well, there's got to be a balance. No. There does not have to be a balance. What we have to do is recognize that this situation is so dire. It's a national emergency. There's plenty of money to be made. You have something like a Green New Deal. There's plenty of money to be made. When you look at solar, when you look at so many sustainable, you look at wind, you look at so many sustainable energy systems. There's plenty of money still to be made. We can make money on a peace economy. We don't have to have a war economy to make a bunch of money. We can have a peace economy. And we don't have to have a dirty energy economy to make a bunch of money. We can have a clean energy economy and make a bunch of money. That was an illusion. That was propaganda, and it stops with me.
Yes, and your support for Green New Deal really points us in that direction, doesn't it? So let me go down into some other things that you surfaced here where you were talking about youth education and affordable health care. Can you talk a little bit more here? What are things that is in your vision and policies that you plan to implement as president?
We need an immediate infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the sinews of our civilization. Millions of American people live with chronic economic anxiety and trauma. And I've seen just even in my career in the last 20 years, how much more that is than there used to be. It's almost like we forget we are the richest country in the world. The American people have been trained to forget that. Oh, we don't have the money for that. Where are we going to get the money for that? Pretty please, may we? Well, that question doesn't come up if we're government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The American people might ask ourselves, why does every other advanced country have universal health care? Now let's talk about what this means. Millions of American people live with the chronic concern, what am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do if one of my kids gets sick? How am I going to pay for my kids to go to college? How am I going to pay off this college loan? So we're burdened. We're like this. When the point is to live like this. The point is to spread your wings. That's what our field understands, that peace and prosperity come when people can stand in the midst of infinite possibility. That's the American dream. But we have a situation now where governmental policy does more to cap people's dreams. Governmental policy is actually used to squelch the American spirit rather than release the American spirit. So I want immediate, and I want it immediate, I want fast. I want universal health care. I want $15 minimum wage, although there's some communities where that's simply too big a leap. So I don't see any reason why the government shouldn't be able to compensate, give stipends while we're on the way there. I want the cancellation of these college loans, and I want free college and university and technical schools for anybody who wants to go. Now, some people say, where are we going to pay for that? That's part of the canard. First of all, when you look at how much money the average American puts into their health care costs, so then you're going to remove those healthcare costs, okay? And you're going to remove the money that people have to spend on their college loans. Guess where that money goes? They spend it. They not only spend it, they are much more capable of rising up and living happy, productive, creative lives. Because you got some money in your pocket, you can make that happen. You can start that project. You can build that website. You have time for your family. You have time to be with your spouse. You have time to talk to your children. You have time to be an engaged citizen. You're not so depressed and anxious all the time. So Every dollar we put into those things is put into the economy because it's put into people's lives. You know, when I was growing up, they used to use a phrase that then began to seem cliched: peace and prosperity. Now I realize they didn't stop using that because it was cliched. They stopped using it because it's no longer the agenda. Our economic system has nothing to do with planning long-term economic good, because it's a leeching of our economic good by a few people on a short-term basis. You want to take better care of your economy 10 years from now, you take better care of your 10-year-olds today. And you help people so that we can all rise. Then you're a happier employer, therefore a more productive employer, a happier employee, therefore more productive. There aren't people working at jobs that they hate just because they need to be there for the benefits, etc. And the same with education. So anything that helps people self-actualize helps your economy. So we now have a small group of people with money, and then they're able to pull all the strings who are saying, no, give the money to us and we'll create your jobs. As though, and it's really what it is, it's a reversion to an aristocratic paradigm. We repudiated that in 1776, and we need to repudiate it again, because this is a completely different theory of where money comes from. No, money will come when I can do all the cool things that I want to do. Money will come when you can do all the cool things you want to do. Money will come when everybody can do all the cool things they want to do. That's what creates money. See, people in our community, this is exactly what I mean. If you have a psychological and emotional and spiritual orientation to life, you actually figure this stuff out more easily, because the brains have been scrambled. That's what's happened in America. It's like people, they're not connecting the dots. And that's why I felt for a long time, Steve, that people who are involved in the transformational world, it should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. We're the last people that should be standing on the sidelines, because we know about like gaslighting and boundaries, and it's all the same stuff, just played out on a large stage.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, politics is our spirituality demonstrated. So we're not standing in the back of the room, are we?
On a collective level.
Yeah. So, well, let me go. You were addressing people all over the country here, and thank you for that as you were going through free training in college, et cetera. But just to go to the heartland and the Rust Belt states that where that supported the current administration. What are the programs that you envision that can support that demographic and that can bring these people along in the 2020 election?
Well, so much of farming in states like Kansas and Iowa, et cetera, has been decimated by agribusiness. And that started back in the 80s. If it was the 1980s and a farmer came to the local banker and said, my crop didn't do well this year, the local banker 90% of the time, 95% of the time would say, that's fine, because you'll do better next year. Starting in the 80s, it's like a guillotine that came down. And those same loans and grants were not given, and it was all because the financial institutions were in cahoots with big agribusiness, and then people had to sell off their farms to agribusiness and now have to do on them pretty much what they're told, because it's not really their choice anymore. This has had a devastating effect on farming. It has had a devastating effect on our land. It has turned agriculture, everything's become cultural, everything's become corporatized, including you've got the factory farm issue, which very much impacts the environmental issue because of the nitrous oxide and the methane gas, et cetera. So the revitalization of rural America, first of all, I see an issue of antitrust, and it's just another area where this corporate hand, this corporate overlord needs to get out of everybody's face so that people can return to the deep and fragile bonds of life, which includes our relationship to the land, our relationship to food, etc. But more than that, or at least as much as that, is that rural America is so rich in possibility for the generation that's come up. The baby boomers' children are now growing up, okay? So the baby boomers' children are now getting married and having children of their own. Now, in many cases, they look at the big cities on the coasts and they say, I don't want the rat race. I can't afford it. And and people are gaining a taste again for like Andy Griffith, you know, people are getting a taste again. Like, wouldn't it be nice if I lived on this nice street and everybody else's kids were out there and they could all ride their bikes together, and We could take walks. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, and gradual, but a generation has grown up that's not just looking for hip, slick, and cool all the time. It's really having their own children and would like a nice place to raise their kids. Guess where holds so much potential? Rural America. However, and that's what this campaign is. I've sat with these guys. I've sat with the Chamber of Commerce people. I've sat with the mayors, and it's the same thing. They know that they could build up the economies of their small towns, right? They could build up the economies of the small towns, invite in all this entrepreneurial spirit, but guess what? Big shock. If it were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, these municipalities would be able to get not only loans, but also grants, cheap loans and grants from the federal government so that, yeah, you're not going to have a problem building your sewage system. You're not going to have a problem building your water system, et cetera. Because all these people I'm talking about who would love to come into these communities and build up and do their entrepreneurial thing, not be in Crazyville on the coast, but they still want to know they have good schools. They still want to know they have hospitals. They still want to know that they have the basics that they need to raise their families. This is where government policy makes all the difference. So what we've been doing is we've been cutting off the supply to these kinds of things. So the same with all of these, every single issue down the line, the government has been withdrawing resources. And this has been going on for decades. The government withdraws resources from the things which actually enable people, releases the entrepreneurial spirit of America. You know, everybody talks about how these just a few corporate heads, they're big entrepreneurs. Let me tell you something. You want to see the entrepreneurial spirit of America on full display. You go to any kindergarten anywhere in this country. That's where you'll see it. So you just pump your resources, you pump your money, you pump your resources into the actual communities where people's lives can be lived at a higher vibrational level, economically, socially, and politically. And then you just see this regreening. It's planting seeds. It's like any other garden. You plant the seeds and then you watch things grow.
Yes, wonderful. So let's now segue over to capitalism and business. You've brought that into the discussion. Let's go a little deeper. So what do we do about untethered capitalism?
When I was a child, the corporation was expected to have a sense of moral and ethical responsibility to the workers, to the community, et cetera. Starting in the 80s, when this trickle-down, market-based economy, untethered. Now, interestingly enough, I used to think that the monster in all of this was Milton Friedman, who came up with the idea of free market, not free market capitalism, but came up with the idea of this trickle-down economics, get government out. The whole theory was get government out. So you don't have financial regulation. You know, everybody says it's so great that we removed all these regulations that were killing business. First of all, those were safety regulations. Those were health regulations. Are we better off that Boeing, are we better off that the FAA was so in bed with Boeing that they weren't the regulations on those airplanes was not as good? Are we better off? Are we better off that the teeth was taken out of the Food and Drug Administration so that for years these pharmaceutical executives have been knowingly marketing these addictive narcotics to people who did not need them? Adhere to these regulations based on safety and health. You actually have to create jobs to do that. And interesting, I have learned, Milton Friedman himself, he wasn't some monstrous force. He himself said, yes, but if you're going to do that, if you're going to get government out of it, what you will need to do when you say that the only responsibility of the corporation is to the fiduciary responsibility to the stockholder, he himself supported some form of universal basic income. So as Elizabeth Warren says, we've just got to hold capitalism accountable. That's what the history of America is about, pushing back against overreach by capitalism when it is untethered to moral and ethical consideration. That's why we have labor laws. That's why we have child labor laws. That's why we have, that's why we had Glass-Steagall. That's why we have antitrust laws, which we need to prosecute again, the way they should be prosecuted. So what we do is that just like in personal relationships, you have boundaries. You have boundaries. You can't overreach. No, you can't overreach. You are one. You are one force. You are one interest. But no, this country isn't supposed to run just so that your short-term profits are better. No, that just did not work that way. And of course, the canard was then their profits would trickle down. Well, we know where that is. So, like I said, you simply don't give the country away to them. Why are we paying $26 billion a year in corporate subsidies to fossil fuel companies? Why did we give a $2 trillion tax cut where 83 cents of every dollar goes to the richest? I'll give you another example. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider, 100 of them we ordered. And the B-21 Raider, each one of them costs $550 million. And each one of them carries both conventional and nuclear weapons. Now, Steve, can you tell me why we need 100 airplanes that carry nukes?
Yeah.
I mean, just think about this. Once again, we got to think about these things deeper. 5 of those, you drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's over for humanity for the next 200, 300,000 years. That has nothing to do with the security needs of the United States. It has to do with the corporate profits of defense contractors and the nuclear industry. What you do is you have a president who says, no way, and who appoints the people who are even ahead of these things, no way. That's what you do. But as long as you have people who are pulling those, who are appropriating that money, whether in the White House or in the Congress.
Yes, and of course you have a powerful vision for waging peace, and you've talked about that extensively. I'm going to just stay on this business and capitalism thread because it's so important. So there may be some good news because Ray Dalio, who runs one of the largest venture funds, is saying that we need to reform capitalism or we risk storming the Bastille. So
you're so right. You know, it's interesting because I was on this MSNBC show with Stephanie Rule. She said, you're even questioning capitalism. I said, I'm not saying anything about capitalism Ray Dalio hasn't said. Or Jeremy Grantham is another one. There are major capitalist leaders in our society right now, exactly like you just said, who absolutely know this thing is unsustainable. Capitalism without a heart is a dangerous force because it's sociopathic. A person who has no remorse, a person who has no sense of ethical responsibility to anyone else is a sociopath. And an economic system which runs that way is a sociopathic economic system. And he's right. If you know French history, you know they'll storm the Bastille. If you know Russian history, they'll have a revolution. And if you've read Yordle the Turtle, you know it's unsustainable. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, and that's why I talk about capitalism with a conscience. And this capitalism, socialism thing is kind of silly anyway. What do you call the police department? It's a socialist institution. What do you call the fire department? A socialist institution. The point is, I don't think anybody who's arguing for these things is arguing for the government to own the means of production. But as Dalio himself has said, capitalism is very good at creating economic opportunities, but not good at taking care of everyone. Socialism is good at taking care of everyone, but not necessarily good at creating economic opportunities. We can have the blend of both that is necessary, and that is that we can have a vibrant capitalist society, but where ethical and moral responsibility is absolutely demanded of those corporations.
Yeah, I love one of the things that you've talked about too is creating a business with a conscience. So what does that look like? Have you kind of thought out how you could help manifest that vision across the business community in the United States?
Well, first of all, the good news is that there are people like Dalio, like Grantham, like John Mackey at Whole Foods with his work, conscious capitalism, et cetera. It used to be that if somebody, prior to 1980, if somebody had worked for decades at a corporation, it was expected that that corporation cared about a dignified retirement. Now the government has actually empowered a cutthroat system where as long as you squeeze the profits, that's what matters most. For instance, I'll give you an example. Stock options, a CEO being paid by stock options wasn't even legal until the 1980s. Wasn't even legal. You know what else wasn't legal till the 1980s? Pharmaceutical companies advertising on television. There are so many ways the government has just said to these major corporate entities, here guys, take the country. And that's what needs to stop. So absolutely, it's a lot of policies. It's a lot of financial regulations. It's a lot of corporate policies. It's a lot of closing of corporate loopholes, a different tax structure. We have just, our tax structure is ridiculous. I have no problem with giving, with asking the very, very, very wealthy among us to carry more of the tax burden. I think they should.
Okay, I shared I wanted to come back and just sort of turn this around where you as president now are speaking to the people, where you're asking for their help. So, of course, there are many, many people that are deeply concerned about the direction of this country. So what is your call to action to all of us? What would you like to see us do now?
You know, when I talk about the infusion of economic hope and opportunity into the lives of people, I think that it should be a quid pro quo. I'm going to do everything I can to remove the shackles, the economic shackles that create so much anxiety in your life. And in exchange for that, I want you to be the best person possible. I want you to be a better father, a better mother, better friend, better parent, better child, better employer, better employee, better citizen. And I want you to use the opportunities that have now been shared with you as they should be by the wealth of this nation in order to improve life for yourself and those around you. I see Donald Trump as a kind of opportunistic infection. He could never have gotten where he's gotten had it not been for a weakened societal immune system, and that's each and every one of us. There has been, even in the higher consciousness and transformational community, a chronic disengagement from politics, often even justified by this counterfeit version of spirituality. And I say it's counterfeit because there's no serious religious or spiritual principle that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. So going to a city council meeting has got to start being the kind of thing that you do on a Thursday night. Lobbying your government, reading the newspaper, knowing what's going on. None of this is going to work unless we all rise up. I also think that we should have a very serious conversation about the possibility of national service. National service, as I envision it, would be that everyone gives between these 1 year between the age of 18 and 26, you give to your country. Now, if you're an architecture student, that year is spent helping with these infrastructure repair projects, right? If you're studying climate science, you're going to be helping at the EPA. If you're studying biology or health, you could be helping in a hospital or a clinic somewhere in a rural community. If you're studying education, you could help in an underprivileged school. And of course, if you want, military would be an option as well. We have taken rugged individualism, which is the high side of the American character, and we have turned it into rugged narcissism. You know, every cell in the body exists in collaboration. No cell in the body exists only for itself. And a cell in the body that sees itself as existing only for itself is a cancer cell. It's malignant when any cell sees itself outside a collaborative matrix. Thank you. That is as true in society as it is in the body. And what has happened on the planet, and this is our spiritual work, of course, what has happened on the planet is that humanity has been infected with a malignant consciousness. So we don't want to give up the rugged individualism part. We love that in America. We're not apologizing for that. But I think that we all know something's become so unbalanced that we have disconnected from a sense that, none of this works for any of us unless it, to some extent, works for all of us. Because all men are created equal and all men were given unalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So I think each and every one of us, if we're going to really transform this country, all of us need to see ourselves as involved. It can't be, well, I'll send the right president or I'll send the right Congress people, because if you only weigh in every 2 years or every 4 years, that can't counter the effect of the fact that corporate lobbyists weigh in every single day. And lots of them all day.
Yes, that's for sure. So, and hopefully, if many share we've entered the age of consciousness. So, and if we've entered the age of consciousness and things such as what you're talking about, narcissism and so on, we'll heal that, because consciousness is not that, right? Consciousness, as you mentioned, is, or nature is the example, where we're all cells in the body of humanity, of life, of the earth, and we're doing this together.
I've known many pretty narcissistic people who speak the language of higher consciousness. I mean, I think that we need to remember that and really make sure that we remember that there is no higher consciousness where there is not infinite love for those, particularly the least among us.
Amen to that. It's an oxymoron, isn't it?
Yeah, but we have our own shadows in our own community, I think.
For sure. So I want to, as we wrap up, I want to congratulate you, Marianne, because I know you've gone over the 65,000 now, which is one of the requirements to be on that Democratic presidential stage during the television debates. But I know that there are lots of challenges, lots of work to be done. So what are the things that we can do to support you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. And I assume that there are people who are watching right now who are among those who sent the donations for the 65,000. So I'm so grateful. That's the first thing I want to say, is how grateful I am to everyone who has participated. The work that needs to be done now, I feel, Steve, there are two different political universes. One is the dog and pony show, what you see on the cable news every night, and who's up and who's down and what percentages, blah, blah, blah. And then there's what happens on the ground. You and me talking. People in living rooms and different places where you're actually with people talking about what affects people's lives. And I feel very confident that if I were getting the same level of press coverage and so forth, that I would be, there's no difference among voters themselves on the ground. What your viewers could do for me is this. Repudiate the thought form that I'm too much of a long shot and it can't happen. That's a force field. That's a force field. And the more it is said, the more it affects the ethers. And then affecting the ethers, it affects my capacity to raise money. Oh yeah, she's great, but she could never win. Well, but then if you don't send me more money, how can I compete? How does my $1.5 million raise compete with somebody else's $10 million or $15 million raise? So the first thing people could do, I remember hearing Werner Erhard many, many years ago when he started the Hunger Project. And somebody said to him, what is the first thing everybody can do? He said, consider the possibility that we could end hunger. And so that's the main thing I want to ask everyone. Please surrender the thought, because that's all it is. It's a thought. It could never happen. Donald Trump is president.
That's right. All things are possible.
Right. And the same people that saying it could never happen are the people who said Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in and Donald Trump would never be president. So that, I think, I need more than anything is for people to join with me. Now, if you do not agree with the things I'm saying, that's different. I honor that. This is a free society. Nobody owes it to any of us to agree with us. But for people who do agree, who feel, wow, this is the direction that we should massively realign our resources in the direction of children, that we should have a U.S. Department of Children and Youth, that we should deal with race on a really serious issue, really get down serious and deal with the systemic racism and the policies, economic, social, and political policies, criminal justice, economic, etc. So we really should get down in our time and make a fundamental break with the past and start expunging this deep racist character defect that still infuses too much of our policy. If you are someone who feels that we should have a peace-creating agenda as robust as the necessary agendas for preparation for war should it be necessary, people who know you can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health, and no, you can't just prepare for war, you have to cultivate peace. For people who say, yeah, that makes sense, and who aren't buying into this idea that only the people whose careers have been entrenched in the system that drove us into this mess, into this ditch, should possibly consider qualified to lead us out of the ditch. If you go, yeah, then please know, and this is possible. Because I'll tell you something, Steve, our community, the higher consciousness, there's so many of us, this community could be rocket booster for me. In some ways has, not at the level that we totally need that it would be if this community really embraced the possible here. I'm not asking people to embrace the impossible. I'm asking people to embrace the possible. The only thing that makes it impossible is our thought that it's impossible. So that's what people can do for me. And if that feels right to you, what you can do for me is go to marianne2020.com, give as generously as you can, as much as your heart feels is right. Get on the volunteer call. I don't know when this is going to be shown. So if you go to the sign up for volunteer, they'll tell you when the next volunteer call is. Get involved, get active. I don't have the same level of media coverage, although it's starting. I have my CNN town hall. I'm going to Washington tomorrow to be on one more of those shows. I mean, you know what's happening. We're like the little engine that could, you know. But you know, this is the thing, Steve. Our community, everything we touch transforms. All those yoga mats, that was our crowd. All that mindfulness stuff, that was our crowd. All this love, 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 miracle stuff, that was our crowd. The only reason politics hasn't transformed is because we haven't gone there yet. With this campaign, the megaphone of a more holistic, integrative model is being placed within the political field. If you just don't agree with me, I honor that. But if you do agree with me, then please help me and do this with me. And go to marianne2020.com and use your voice and get on Facebook and get on my Twitter and get on Instagram and talk it up and repudiate this notion that it's not possible and repudiate this notion that it has to be one of them. You know, we should include in our notion of political expertise wisdom. It's not enough to just know how the mechanics of government operates. You've got to have wisdom. What experienced politicians took us into Iraq. And experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. Experienced politicians took us to where we are. I have a lot of experience. It's different experience. And I think, a lot of qualifications. It's different qualifications. People say you don't know how Washington works. First of all, I know more about Washington works than some people might think. Secondly, the idea that someone has been a congressman, two-term congressman, what they're qualified, anybody who thinks that 2 terms in Congress is what gives you the elevated consciousness or deep gravitas to run a nation, doesn't know what congressmen do all day, because 60% of their time is spent raising money. So the founders, when they said what was a necessary qualification, 14 years living here, which I have, 35 years old or older, which I am, born here, which I was. They didn't say it had to have been a governor or a senator or a congressman or a mayor. If they had wanted to, they would have. But they were leaving it to every generation to determine for itself the qualifications that they feel are the qualifications necessary to navigate the times in which we live. My skill set is the skill set that emerges from our community, to know what's really going on under the surface, inside people, what makes people change, what makes people desperate. We're going to sit here and try to heal the opioid crisis by dealing with addicts. We need to deal with the fact that we are raising generations upon generations of people so desperate that dysfunctional pathological behavior is more probable. So that's what I would ask. I would ask that your listeners think about this. You have been so kind and generous. Thank you so much for having me on. And I just hope that if anybody feels a yes in their heart, it's kind of like with politics, you know what to do. Go to the website and help me out here.
All right, and that'll be the last word. Marianne, thank you. And so you're inviting people to believe. You know, we talk about reducing or eliminating these beliefs that don't make any sense, and we start right here, right?
Yeah, possibility
that Marianne can't be president. So we just we get rid of that one, believe, and then pedal to the metal, just go all in. And you mentioned going to your website, marianne2020.com, and also your volunteer calls, because you can use them. So lots of invitations there, everybody. And of course, in Humanities Team, we stand for, we're all about the planetary awakening, and not just some awakening, just some awareness. We're about living into the unity of all of life, which means that in this generation, that in all spheres of life, and in politics, a very important sphere of life, that we get involved and we do it and we live it, because clearly we're not heading in the right direction now.
And if you leave politics out of it.
Yeah, what was that, Marianne?
Well, if you leave politics out of it,
Yeah.
you know, cause and effects works for an individual and cause and effect works for a group. And if everybody who believes that and would like to see it in politics throws $5 or $10 my way, wow, we can really make a difference.
So there's an invitation. Yeah, Marianne, thank you. Thank you for your courage to be out there, to be going up on stage and to be taking it down to this deeper level. I actually grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My father worked on Capitol Hill, so I had exposure to all of it. And it's not an easy thing to walk in this whole new paradigm, this whole new worldview, this whole new vision for what governance should be. So thank you for your courage.
Thank you. Your support means everything. I so appreciate it.
Okay. Namaste.
Namaste.